Hi, I'm Nick Haig, and welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast. Michael Bungay Stanier has written 8 books and is probably best known for his best-selling book, The Coaching Habit, that sold more than 1 million copies and is the best-selling book on coaching this century. In addition to his writing, he founded Box of Crayons, a learning and development company, and is currently focusing all his attention on MBS Works. And just looking at that website shows a wealth of different resources that people can tap into in order to unlock their greatness. What will hopefully become clear today is that Michael is a storyteller, and when he talks, people do listen. In fact, one of his TED Talks has been seen by over 1.5 million people. I just know you're going to love this conversation today. So welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast, Michael.
Thank you, Nick. I'm not sure I quite fit that category, world's greatest business thinkers, but I'll take it. I can pretend for an hour or so.
Well, we're going to talk about one book in particular, but you've got another 7 books that sit behind that. And from your consultancy background and anything else, I think, I'd like to see you, your name up in lights under the World's Greatest Business.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate that.
I've just given a brief introduction about you, but it would be great if you could start today by giving our listeners a bit more background to who you are, the work you do, and also the background to why you wrote your latest book, How to Work with Almost Anyone.
Sure. Well, I'm a writer. I'll work backwards. I'm a writer, and I tend to write books that are kind of practical tools for busy managers and leaders. If you know me at all, you know me for a book called The Coaching Habit, which came out 8 years ago and has just become the best-selling book on coaching this century, which is amazing. Not least because it got turned down 6 or 7 times by a publisher, so I ended up self-publishing it. So, I have not only success, but a degree of smugness as well.
What a great story.
Yeah, it is. So I'm committed to helping managers and leaders just do a better job at being human and bringing out the humanness in the work they do, and do work that makes a difference in their organizations. And some books support that. And I'm also committed to people who are trying to help figure out what their next big thing is, particularly people in midlife. So I've got some books and some training and stuff around that. Now, how did I get here? Well, there's, it all looks like I had a plan, but I never had a plan. I just stumbled into the future like most of us.
Yeah.
But the salient facts are, I'm Australian, grew up in Australia, went to high school and university there, and did both a law degree and a literature degree in Australia, and was saved from becoming a unhappy and not very competent lawyer by winning a scholarship that took me from Australia to Oxford, where I studied. I did a master's degree in literature, where, honestly, the best thing that happened is I met my wife, who's Canadian. And so now I'm in England with a master's degree in literature. I turned down the opportunity to do a PhD because I'm like, I don't know if I have the intellectual chops for it, and I'm not sure I want to be an academic, even if I did. And still didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and found myself working for an innovation company, helping invent products and services. And it was best of times, worst of times. Best of times in that it was a funky culture. I had long hair, I had earrings, I sewed my own clothes, and they're like, "You're weird, but we like you. Come and work with us." Worst of times, overstating it a bit, but I was doing work that didn't really make the world a better place. I played very minor roles in helping invent stuffed crust pizza, helping invent what's been called the worst single malt whiskey ever invented. I have my fingerprints on some of those things. I'm like, what am I doing? This is my one and precious life. So moved into the world of change and change management, and joined a consultancy that took me from London to Boston. Lived and worked in Boston for a few years. And then in 2001, headed to Canada, set up my own shop, and that became Box of Crayons, which finally found its niche, which is around kind of teaching the IP from The Coaching Habit, and the sister book, The Advice Trap, and training in big organizations. So that's Yeah,
Well, I mean, I
so
think
not very exciting list of kind of my greatest hits.
Well, not at all. And I think, first of all, that the modesty sticks in terms of, the fact that you feel that you shouldn't be on this show. You definitely should. And I think, that story of where you've come from and where you are today, I think it's a fabulous one. I think it's an inspiring one. And it shows, that we should continue to persist in our lives, shouldn't we? Because we
Yeah.
never quite know where we'll end up. Likewise with myself, there was no grand plan. I'm a geologist, but didn't end up on the oil rigs, and here we are on a podcast show. So,
Exactly.
um,
There is a quote I love, which is inspiration is when your past suddenly makes sense. And there's a way that you kind of look back going, oh, here's why I learned that or did that or suffered through this relationship or whatever. Um, and if you're lucky, you've persisted long enough on the right stuff and you've abandoned the wrong stuff soon enough and you end up somewhere interesting and somewhere happy.
Absolutely. Well, and to that point, I did study geology, and I remember saying to my father, why am I doing this? And actually, when I look back on my life, 26 years as a researcher, exploring, pulling bits of information together to actually, look at the bigger picture, then I suppose there's a semblance of truth of leaning back on my geological days and
Right.
what that looked like. So, Michael, let's turn our attention to your latest book, and I love the title of your book because it grabs the attention straight away when you laser in on that almost part,
Yeah.
and some difficult characters from my working career certainly popped into my mind when I first read the title.
And they've
Who
talked
were
to me about you as well. They've said, yeah, he's a bit of a nightmare. So I totally get that.
Yeah. So, I mean, having started and built an agency in my previous life, I know the importance of working relationships. So I found myself definitely nodding in agreement from page one, where you talk about happiness and success being driven by the relationships you have with your colleagues, your co-directors, and also your clients. So
Yeah.
the starting point of your book is this fundamental to happiness and success. Why leave it to chance? You've done a lot of research in the background on, what drives this, and there's three essential attributes that dictate how to create this, what you call best possible relationship. Can you expand on what these three attributes are and the
Sure.
importance of each?
Yeah. And thanks for the compliment about the title of the book because it's the best title I've ever come up with. Because how to work with almost anyone. I think the universal reaction is people smile and nod because they're like, I get the importance of working with people, and I get how some people are a nightmare, and I'll never be able to work with them. So there's a kind of it speaks to a deep truth,
Yeah.
and um, I th- and I think it's also worth just lingering on this idea that our happiness and our success depends to a large extent on the quality of our working relationships. Um, it's something that people kind of get intuitively, but they don't spend a lot of time there. They go, yeah, yeah, whatever. But for the people who are listening, if you pause for a moment and you think to yourself, think of a bad working relationship you had in the past, and just think how that contaminated the work you did and the sense of self you have and the confidence you had and the trust you had and the happiness you had. It far outweighed kind of the work you were doing. I mean, you might have been working on something pretty cool, but you had a bad boss or a nightmare collaborator, and it changed everything. And likewise, if you think just for a moment of some of the very best working relationships you've had, the ones that lit you up, the ones that were like, man, that was so cool. This is how I want working relationships to be. You'll see that that has a way of elevating the experience of working. It doesn't really matter what you're working on. It could have been kind of slightly boring stuff. I mean, I think of my friend Anton, and I remember us doing focus groups up in the north of Scotland on soup. We were talking to Scottish women about how they felt about soup. And if you're thinking to yourself, that doesn't sound like that much fun, you're like, you're right. That is not soul feeding work. And I was doing it with my friend Anton, and I'm like, it was pretty good crack. Like we had a fun time doing that. I learned a lot. I enjoyed his company. So a good working relationship can really elevate the experience of the work you do.
Yeah.
Um, but mostly we don't actively try and improve our working relationships. We just take them for granted and hope for the best. And the heart of this book is going, look, take responsibility for your working relationship. You're not trying to build perfect relationships. You're trying to build the best possible relationships. It's a kind of key phrase in the book, BPR, best possible relationship. Kind of acknowledges that every working relationship has an amount of potential, and you can expand that potential somewhat, but really your job is to try and fulfill that potential as much as possible. And some working relationships have more potential than others. Some working relationships like this could be amazing. And other working relationships, you're like, I'm just hoping this is less bad.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get it to suck a little bit less. So BPR, and then just as you asked, it's like, what's a BPR then? Well, it has three core characteristics. It needs to be safe, and it needs to be vital, and it needs to be repairable. Safe and vital and repairable.
So, that safety aspect, I think, safe, well, we've all got to feel safe to share ideas. And
Yeah, Amy Edmondson's kind of made that really clear. She's been talking about psychological safety for 25 years, and just saying, if you don't feel safe, you don't speak up, you don't show up. If you feel safe, you show up and you speak up. And when you show up and you speak up, the team you're on performs better.
yeah. Yeah, and in fact, I spoke to Amy on one of my previous podcast show, and from her book, "Learning How to Fail," it can certainly help us thrive, and removing that fear, it definitely leads to expanding that capacity of innovation in the
Right.
workplace too, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So we've got safety, we've got vital, and we've got repairable,
Yeah.
and as you say in this BPR, best possible relationships. We're not talking about perfect relationships here. We're talking about how we can make them flourish to the maximum, at least.
Yeah.
Of those three attributes, safe, vital, and repairable, is one more important than the other?
I don't think so. I think depends. What is true is the right mix of safe, vital, and repairable is going to be different in different working relationships that you have. Safe means psychological safety. Vital really means psychological bravery. How much do you push? How much do you challenge? How much do you step into ambiguity? How much do you kind of say the hard thing?
Yeah,
And repairable is this idea that every working relationship will go off the rails at some stage. How quickly can you get it back? How quickly can you more actively repair it rather than just going, I'm hurt, I'm wounded, and then your little lizard brain takes over and you either move into fight or flight mode, run away or try and attack. So you're trying to find what safe, vital, and repairable looks like when it's you and one other person working together. What does that mean? And I think the key thing to notice is you probably have a bias to one of those three things. A facility with one of those things where I'm better at safe, or I'm better at vital, or I'm better at repairable. And what's helpful to notice about that is the thing that you're best at is most likely the thing that you have privileged and said, this is the most important thing. So it's a clue to what your bias is, to what your kind of belief is around, of all the things I do, this is the thing that matters most. And then knowing your bias is really helpful because your bias is just your bias. It's not the truth. And, you know, I might be working with you, Nick, and you're like, safety is a thing for me. And I know for me, vital is a thing for me. I'm like, I've been in safe relationships, and I find if all they are is safe, they're a bit boring for me, a bit smothering. I want a bit
yeah,
more risk and a bit more challenge and a bit more kind of banter and a bit more kind of danger. Um, but if you don't know that about me and I don't know that about you, we're destined to have some sort of falling out.
yeah, yeah. Well, and I think motivation change. If I think back to early in my life, then it was the pay packet. It was making sure that I had enough money to
Yeah,
survive. But motivation changes, doesn't it? And I think it comes. If I'm thinking about myself now, it's about having that sense of purpose, that
right,
autonomy, mastery, and I get greatest satisfaction from learning and learning new things every day.
right.
Which I love this podcast for. Reading excellent books like yourselves, and
Thank you. Well, that
um,
what you're talking about there is slightly different because safe, vital, and repairable are kind of they're the pillars a relationship stands on. what's really interesting is if you and I then get into a conversation about how do we work together, and I learned that you like the the learning and the growth and the exploration and the connection or whatever your language might be around that. Um, that then gives me another layer on top of those more fundamental rhythms of safe, vital, and repairable.
Yeah. Well, let's. So we've set the scene, if you like, in terms of the best possible relationship and those three attributes. But at the heart of creating this relationship between others lies this keystone conversation that you
Yeah,
talk about, and I really like that term. Again, we all know the importance of a keystone in architecture. It bears the
yeah,
weight of a bridge or an arch, but you use an analogy in the book, which I really like, of
yeah.
what happened when grey wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in '95.
Yeah, I mean, it really works well as a metaphor, just in the architectural sense, because a keystone conversation. I mean, the big idea of the book is your working relationships drive your happiness and success. So do something about it.
Yeah,
Don't just hope for the best. The key thing I suggest you do is you have a keystone conversation, a conversation about how we work together before you plunge into the work itself. That's the key takeaway from the book. Let's like, talk about how we work. How can we work best before we get into the actual work? And it's simple, but it's not easy. Simple, but difficult. Um, and called Keystone because it's perfect as a metaphor. A keystone in architecture brings two columns of stone together, connects them, settles them, strengthens them. It's all the things you want in a working relationship as well. But it was cool to discover that in ecology they use this idea of a keystone species, and it's a species that whose presence has a really significant impact on the overall health of the ecosystem. And so, just as you said, the gray wolves in Yellowstone National Park, and people can Google this. There's a short film about it, which is fabulous. Um, they'd been hunted to extinction. Americans with guns, and what it meant is that the dominant, the alpha creature, top of the pyramid in Yellowstone National Park were elk, and they were causing havoc and destruction. They were eating everything, they were trampling on everything. The whole ecosystem was being kind of worn out, worn down, denuded because of the presence of these elk. But then when they introduced a small pack of gray wolves, they ate some of the elk. They definitely scared the elk away so that they were in more remote parts. And it meant that the trees grew back and the grass grew back and the river changed shape and the birds showed up and the fish showed up and the beavers showed up. And the whole system got back to being diverse and healthy and robust because of the impact of these gray wolves.
yeah.
And so a keystone, whether you like buildings or whether you like the outdoors, it helps the system bear strength, grow stronger, and stay diverse. And actually, that's what you want in your working relationships as well.
Yeah, yeah, and that resilience and flourishing as well. Being able to grow. I do. I really like it as a metaphor.
Yeah, thank you.
So there's these five questions then that are fundamental to the Keystone conversation, and that, if I can, I'd like to unpack each in detail with you. So, starting with question one, it's all about stating what you're best at, your most important qualities. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, oh well, I'm British. We're a bit more self-deprecating. Sometimes it doesn't come naturally to say, hey, I'm really good at
I'm
this.
amazing. Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
yeah. So, but it's important to do this with the amplify question, isn't it?
Yeah. And the way I think about it is you're doing this in service of somebody else. You're not doing it because you're a blowhard or you're a show off or you're a diva or you're egotistical or you're thinking of moving to North America where apparently they do this all the time. It's because you're trying to communicate to the other person, when do you shine and when do you flow? Because if you and I are working together, Nick, and you come to me and you're like, let me tell you when I really light up. Let me tell you the stuff that I'm not only good at, but I'm fulfilled by. So I get really excited about it. because there's one part of me is going, okay, so I don't know much about Nick, but I know he's a geologist, so I'll give him all the rock sorting exercises, metaphorically and
Yeah.
literally.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, you're like, there's a bunch of stuff I can do. I've just been around long enough that I've got vaguely competent across a whole range of areas. But I don't want to do all of that. In fact, there's a whole bunch of things I definitely don't want to do that are involved in that. So self-understanding about, let me tell you when I'm at my best, let me tell you when I light up, let me tell you when I'm in the flow state. um, all of that is a useful self-knowledge for you. I mean, it's just helpful for you to go, no, notice this. When are you at your best?
Yeah.
Because you want more of that, right? And what a gift to give that to somebody else and say, I can tell you when I'm at my best. There's each of there's as you said, there are 5 questions in the Keystone conversation, and each of the 5 questions has 3 exercises associated with it to help you do the work and figure some of the answers out, beyond the first 2 obvious answers. And one of the exercises for this first question, the amplify question, what's your best, is a little 2 by 2 matrix, and it talks about the difference between being good at something and fulfilled by something. So imagine a vertical axis with good at and a horizontal axis with fulfilled by. And it means you've got 4 boxes. And it's really helpful if you can tell people what you are good at and fulfilled by. And honestly, the more things you have in that box, the happier you are in your role at the moment. It's helpful for you to say to somebody, here's what I am good at, but not fulfilled by. Because what people do is they make up that just because you're good at it, you want to be doing it. And we all know that that's not the case. It's helpful to be able to say to somebody, here's what I am fulfilled by, but not yet good at. Because that's you going, I'd like to do this,
Yeah.
but I need supervision. I need coaching. I need a safety net. I need some support or training or whatever around that. That's helpful. And what I hope for everybody is there's nothing in the I'm not good at it and I'm not fulfilled by it, because what the hell are you doing doing that work if you're not only screwing it up, but it's screwing you up.
Yeah, I do. I really like that. You call it the competent trap, don't you? That matrix, and I
Yeah,
think again, it's so important because in our working lives, we need to feel fulfilled. Coming back to what
yeah,
we discussed earlier on, so
yeah.
no, I really do like that. B2B Frameworks is a curated collection of proven business frameworks to develop your strategic thinking skills, solve your biggest business problems, and unlock your next promotion. Our mission is to help you achieve these goals. We want to create the next generation of successful business leaders by providing the tools and frameworks needed to create effective strategies that drive business growth. Each framework comes with a downloadable set of instructions with large, colourful diagrams and editable templates to guide you through the process step by step and prompt you to consider the problem from every possible angle. Along with audio guides and educational tools, our extensive content library is full of real-world examples and case studies of strategic thinking in action. So why learn with B2B Frameworks? We've carefully curated only the most effective, proven business and marketing frameworks. Our downloadable materials and audio guides will help you easily apply each framework. And the insights and advice you'll find across the site are based on 30 years of consulting experience from one of the world's leading business strategy experts, Paul Haig. B2B Frameworks is a small investment to advance your career or grow your business. Start your journey to becoming a successful business leader by joining B2B Frameworks today. So that's question 1. Then there's the steady question, and this is vitally important to let your colleagues know who you are, how you work. Because again, I saw this as a really crucial question to let others know about our funny quirks to make that smoother working relationship. If I think back to my colleagues, there was this mixture of extroverts and introverts. People were last minute in delivering reports at night, whereas some were there first thing. People work differently, and so understanding that is so important.
Exactly. And it's remarkable how short our memory is that people work differently. So every time you start a new working relationship, you're like, oh, we'll probably be the same-ish. And you might be, but you might not be as well. And it's amazing how different things are like, I'm a bit more last minute, you're a bit more kind of get it done right away. Um, how that can set up conflict. Even
Yeah.
things as just as simple as like, what's your name? What's your pronouns? All of that stuff. I
Yeah.
mean, my name I've been explaining to people for 30 years. I got married 30 years ago. When I got married, my wife and I combined our surnames, so I became Bungay Stanier. We didn't put a hyphen in. And so people get freaked out by that all the time. And also they call me Mike or Mick. And I don't like either of those. I like Michael. Um, and nowadays we often share our pronouns with people because we've just realized that it's not as common sense as we thought it might be. And it's helpful for me if I look at you and I go, is it Nick or is it Nicholas? Or is it I don't know, is it NH?
Yeah.
I don't know what you know, you might like to go by the NHS as some sort of nod to the British health system. Who knows? I don't know. We
Well,
get
in
to have
fact,
that
throughout my
conversation.
course of time, I've probably been called all of those.
Exactly.
But you're right. You can offend someone if you don't know that from. So setting that stall out from the beginning.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
then things like, you're an email person, you're a phone person, you're a meeting person. How do you like feedback? There's all sorts of little things you can exchange to go. If you know this about me, you're less likely to grind the gears.
Yeah. Then I'm going to lump the next two questions together because there's the good date and there's the bad date question.
Yeah,
Uh,
they're
and
definitely sister questions.
yeah, so what are these questions intended to do, and what can we learn from them?
Yeah. Well, the key insight is that the patterns from our past repeat again in our future. And they do that with your working relationships. And it doesn't matter that it's a different person at a different time in a different culture with a different problem, with a different level of status or rank or hierarchy or whatever. Your stuff keeps showing up. It's like a fractal pattern. Doesn't matter, every time you dive in a little further, it's the same pattern that keeps showing up. So use that. It's really helpful if you can say, when I last worked with somebody like you, and it was a really good relationship. Here's what happened. Here's what they did to make this a good working relationship. And here's what I did to make this a good working relationship. And how helpful is it to hear somebody else go, last time I worked with somebody like you and it was really good. Let me tell you what happened.
Yeah,
Let me tell you what the other person did that really helped. Let me tell you what I did that really helped. That is a really powerful exchange of information to give yourself the best chance of going, well, I'd like this to be one of the best working relationships I have as well. So you've given me some clues as to how to get there. And the bad day question, it's a variation on it. It's like, what can we learn from past frustrating relationships? And so often we try and we're in denial a little bit about our past and our struggles. We're like, I just la 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 la, pretend that didn't happen. But what a gift to be able to say, "Look, Nick, last time I worked with somebody like you, and it was hard and a bit mediocre. Let me tell you what kind of took us down a bad path. Let me tell you what I did. How did I collude? How did I screw up? How did I contribute to the dysfunction? Let me tell you what they did. And now you do the same for me." And I'm like, okay, great. We've got a whole lot of clues about the things we shouldn't be doing, you and me and us, to try and keep this working relationship out of the muck.
yeah, yeah, and that wealth of understanding, it really does help in,
Yeah,
especially in those difficult times, uh, to make it repairable, and that takes us on to the fifth question. So, with repair, what question are we looking to understand here, or
yeah.
what are we trying to do when we talk repair?
So in writing the book, I did a lot of deep dive research into the kind of the big names in the world of romantic relationships. So people like Esther Perel and Terry Real and the Gottmans and Dan Siegel. These are people who've been writing and thinking and developing insight for 30, 40, 50 years on how we work when we're in relationship. And across all of their work, there's a kind of two-part insight. Part one is relationships that last and thrive and grow tend to be ones that get repaired. And part two is most of us kind of suck at repairing. We're not very good at it. But the power of how will we fix it when things go wrong, which is the
Mm.
repair question. How will we fix it when things go wrong? Is that it's kind of threefold. One is it acknowledges that things will go wrong, and that in itself is hugely powerful and hugely helpful. Because often when we're at the start of a working relationship, we're like, "Oh no, this will be the one working relationship which is flawless," and somehow we keep defaulting to that. Secondly, it says we are committed to it getting fixed. So there's this kind of open-hearted commitment to saying, let's if it gets ripped, let's uh, repair it, you and me. And thirdly, it gives permission to talk about the relationship when it starts going wrong, because that's often a hard thing to acknowledge and talk about. But when you go, how will we fix it when things go wrong? You've now got permission to go, hey, Nick, I think this is going wrong. This isn't the right working relationship we were dreaming of. So what do we need to do here to get it back on track?
Yeah, yeah. And I spoke with Urs Koenig on the last episode of this podcast, and he talked a similar message about how radical humility, his latest book, can lead to the stronger relationship. Because becoming really good at knowing how to apologize,
Yeah,
but with sincerity and heart, really does then, give a powerful gift to building, the future, that strong relationship in the future.
nice. Now, I
Um,
don't know this book. How would you articulate what radical humility is?
Radical humility. Well, I think it's about, from a humility angle, it's about being radical, so doing everything to its maximum.
Yep.
And I think, they're making sure that you set the boundaries. Just the fact that you do not know everything, and using
Hmm.
relationships with your team in order to build that. So, he's an ex-NATO UN peacekeeper.
Wow.
So he talks a lot about his time in the Middle East, and also his time in Serbia as well.
Yeah. Oh, that
And
sounds cool.
Yeah, and I think in fact, Amy Edmondson put me onto him because
Right.
she didn't have time to join this particular podcast, even though she joined my last podcast. And
Right.
she said, around leadership, this is the particular book that's really interesting me at the moment, and you should get
Nice.
ours on. So I recommend. In fact, you can
All
see it
right.
on the shelf behind me.
I'm making a note of it because that sounds great.
Yeah.
Because for me, humility is a what it means to me is a deeper understanding of who you are.
Well, it does start. I mean, it's about understanding your failings. Yeah, exactly. What you know, what you don't
Yeah.
know, but also having that growth mindset to
Right.
be able to learn from others.
Yeah. Because often humility gets framed as oh, I'm not worthy, and I don't think that's it at all. It's understanding that you're to coin a phrase, like you're the full catastrophe. So you have strengths, you have joys, you have weaknesses, you have blind spots, and it's kind of getting a sense of that. It's that sense of your feet on the ground. I've got a really good reading on who I am and an ongoing curiosity to continue to learn and grow. I think that gets really close to radical humility. And that's an essential part of what this is about because these five questions, I mean, to have a keystone conversation, there's kind of three phases. Phase one is actually preparing your own answers to the questions. And like I say, in the book, each question has three exercises associated with it. So it's an invitation to radical humility to kind of go, oh, here's who I am at my
Yeah,
best, at my worst. Here are my blind spots. Here are my strengths. And when you're in there, it's a great gift to then be able to communicate that to somebody else. Going, let me tell you who I really am,
absolutely.
so that you and I can work better together.
Well, I'll drop you after this podcast. I can even connect you, but there is definite synergies between the two books, and likewise, in terms of you know the fact that it's a workbook and there's exercises within
Right.
to work alongside.
Sounds fantastic.
So we've talked through we've set the scene in terms of what a best possible relationship can look like. We've talked about the keystone conversation and the 5 questions that sit within that. I want to play devil's advocate, Michael, with you for a minute, because normally, and I'm thinking back to my working life as a researcher,
Yeah.
we're given a task as a team, or I'll give out a task to the team, and then there's that pressing need to dive straight in, complete that job in hand. And therefore, it's not normal practice. When I was reading the book, I was thinking to ask your colleagues these questions,
No, it's not.
especially if you're looking up the hierarchy to speak to your boss, for example. But in your best-selling book, the Coaching Habit, you introduce the Terror model, which
Right.
explains the neuroscience of engagement and this importance of making sure people feel safe in the workplace.
Right.
And I just wondered whether, does this play a part here when looking to set up this conversation with
Yeah.
others? Making sure that expectations. Am I able to actually ask these questions or not?
So I don't think there's a devil's advocate role in this. I think it's really clear that this stuff is simple but difficult.
Yeah,
It's unusual. It's not. These aren't conversations that happen a lot in organizations. So the thought of going up to somebody and going, "Hey, let's have a conversation about how we work together,
yeah,
so we can work better together." On one hand, it's like that feels like a reasonable thing to ask, but it's also an unusual thing to ask. So there is a way that you can make up all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't ever ask that.
yeah,
They're terrible. They're not important. I'm not ready. They're not ready. What would we talk about? This could get awkward. You know, um, the brain is wired to keep you safe, to keep you out of places of ambiguity and uncertainty and danger. And this feels a bit uncertain, ambiguous, and dangerous. Um, so part of the way of increasing the terror factor, terror stands for tribe, expectation, rank, and autonomy, 4 levers that help contribute to psychological safety, basically. Um, uh, one is to do your own work, so you've got your sense of what your questions might be. And then the second thing is to temper the approach to the person you're having a conversation with. I mean, there might be people in your team where you're like, "This is relatively easy. we should have this conversation." There might be your boss where you go, "There's power differential here. Um, so what do I want to talk to her about, and what might be appropriate?" Um, I will say, as somebody who leads teams, if somebody on my team comes to me and says, "Can we have a conversation about how to work better together so I can be really great at working with you?" I'm pretty delighted by that.
yeah,
Like that's all upside for me.
yeah,
Um, you might look at some people and go, "Man, we've been butting heads for a year." Um, the way I think about it is, uh, when you identify the key working relationships you have. Let's say you got 5, and you're like, "Here are my top 5 people who influence my success and my happiness." You then have a choice with every single one of them. And there might be your boss, it might be somebody on your team, it might be a peer or a collaborator, it might be a client, it could be anywhere in that kind of ecosystem. You're faced with a stark choice. Have the conversation or don't have the conversation. And those are your options. And the way I think about it is every choice you have has prizes and punishments. There's an upside and there's a downside to every act, every choice. So when you think about that other person, whoever they are, what are the prizes for having a conversation about how you work together? What might you get out of it? What are the rewards? But what's at risk? What's dangerous? What's the punishment for that conversation?
yeah,
And likewise, you could just skip it altogether and just go, just carry on as we are. Prizes and punishments for that as well. And rather than relying on your kind of gut instinct and the vibe and the feel of it, it's worth doing a little more rigorous thinking about it because the book is called How to Work with Almost Anyone. So it sort of says, sure, there are some people where you're like, this is probably not a good idea. But it's very easy for all of us just to kind of rule out too many people and just go too hard with them, too difficult, too weird, too odd, too unexpected. I don't know when we'd find the time. And I'd encourage you to actually be braver about having those conversations.
yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think, the more you do anything, the easier it becomes, doesn't it? So,
Indeed. Yeah.
it make it more common practice. But I was putting myself, into the shoes of when I was, a manager, director of my company. And if someone, as you
Yeah.
say, came up to me and asked that, I think it would actually set themselves apart, from
Exactly.
the
You're
masses.
like, I
Yeah,
look at you in a different way as somebody who
absolutely.
is mature enough, emotionally intelligent enough, strategic enough
Yeah,
to try and build good working relationships with the people with power and influence. You're
yeah,
like, no, that's impressive. You should do that more often.
yeah, for sure. Okay, with my questions, we're going full circle in our conversation because I started today by talking about that almost part in the book's title, and
Yeah.
I want to hone in on that again. In fact, you just touched on it before because you talk about the fact that well, in the book, relationships do disintegrate over time. That's
Yep.
inevitable. So it's and sometimes we know from our past experience not every relationship is repairable. So is there any guidelines to what happens when it's time to say goodbye, or how to at least leave a future working relationship so it's amicable for the future?
Well, you have a choice as to how you leave. That's the key thing. And, broadly speaking, you probably have three choices. One is you just sneak out quietly. And it's like, wait, has anybody seen Nick? It's like, oh no, Nick's left the building. Um, the other is you set things on fire. You burn bridges. You kind of blow things up. You're like, screw you. I'm going to cause havoc before I leave. And the fourth one is you try and make it awake. In that Irish tradition of like it's a celebration. It's not just grieving. It's a celebration as well.
Yeah,
And it won't surprise anybody to hear me say each one of those choices has prizes and punishments. You know, if you can, there's probably some truth in the more relationships you can leave in a way where um, that relationship is alive rather than dead. There's a way probably going to be helpful for you somewhere down the line. Work happens through people. Life happens through people. So the more relationships you have, the more you've got those kind of strong and weak connections that can help you thrive. And you might be like, I need to leave, you need to leave, and I'm going to be as generous as possible and as kind as possible and as forgiving as possible in the letting it go because I'm not going to burn that relationship. That can be a good choice. It can also be a great choice to go and we're done and we shan't be working together again. So I'm not going to burn things down necessarily, but I'm not going to make a deal of it. I'm just going to like terminate the relationship and exit out the building.
yeah, yeah. This podcast is sponsored by B2B Frameworks. And in this conversation today, we've talked about the Terra model and the competent trap framework from your consultancy background, but also your business experience through MBS Works. Which business framework would you choose to be your favorite? Why is it your favorite? And just some background to the framework itself.
Yeah. I think the one I come back to, it's a framework, it's a pair of questions, is it's from the coaching habit book and it's called the strategic question. It's like, if I'm going to say yes to this, what must I say no to?
Yeah,
So it's the simplest of models, but it just makes really clear the price you pay for saying yes to something. And it also makes really clear if your yes is going to mean anything, what are you going to have to turn down? What are you going to have to shape? Because you're already at full capacity. You can't add a yes. Yeses mean nothing unless they come with a no. So it makes for a more rigorous framework of understanding what your commitments might be.
yeah. You got to prioritize. You got to laser in. You got to
You got to
focus.
make
You
some
got to
tough choices
sacrifice.
because when
Yeah,
you're saying, you know, what am I saying yes to? Therefore, what must I say no to? It actually means who must I say no to? Because there's always a person attached to the what.
yeah,
So you need to be braver around that.
yeah. And to conclude, Michael, I'm entering the quick fire round of questions that I ask all my guests.
Yep.
From your book, I mean, you mentioned so many different books in the back of it. So you do love books, I know that, and you mentioned a lot. But
True.
what are you reading at the moment?
I'm reading Emily Watson's translation of the Iliad,
Okay,
and I really like it. It's also just a really long book. So I've got that going. And then I'm also reading Derek Sivers' latest book on, it's kind of on leadership. I can't remember. It's called something like The Most Important Book You'll Ever Read, 27 Theories of Life and One Unexpected Conclusion. Derek Sivers, he has this kind of remarkable influence because he's not on social media. He's not really a thought leader. He's American, but lives in New Zealand. But people who love him a lot. So I'm reading both of them.
you mentioned two books which I'd never heard of in your latest book. Around the hidden life of trees and finding the mother tree, and I thought I've sourced those out and bought those actually on Amazon.
Fantastic.
I haven't started reading them yet, but I thought
Yeah.
they sounded really
Yeah.
fascinating.
I try and read um uh I try and read a diverse range of books
Yeah,
because if you all you read is leadership books, you're in a pretty big echo chamber.
yeah,
But if you read biology and art and fiction and young adult fiction, there's a way that you can get really enriched and you kind of come at knowledge from different perspectives.
yeah, yeah. In terms of a business book, is there a best business book or one that really sits in the mind that you'd recommend to our listeners?
Well, so much of it depends what you're looking for. Uh, and so much of my business stuff is centered around self-management and self-knowledge. Because there's books like the Roger Martin book on something winning, which is kind of like the five core strategic questions and how they kind of mesh together. That's a great book,
Yeah,
but it's a strategic book. It's like Roger Martin is a consultant and former dean of Rotman Business School and very brilliant, and CEO of Procter and Gamble's right hand man for a while. So super smart, but not a whole lot of self development stuff there. Um, but if you want kind of mantras to guide yourself, like for instance, Austin Kleon's book, How to Steal Like an Artist, you wouldn't call that a business book, but it's a really good book.
yeah, yeah. Well, two great books for our listeners to look up, and likewise for myself in terms of the last there. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever been given?
I'm not sure, advice is all transient, um, and it comes and it goes. It probably centers back around the yes and the no question that I talked about earlier, which
Yeah,
is like, what are you focusing on? What choices are you making? Make braver choices. I mean, on my wall, I've got a poster. And again, it's not really business advice, but I'm like, it says, be brave, life is joyous. I'm like, that's pretty good advice.
yeah. Which business leader do you most admire?
Well, I really admire Shannon Minifee. She is the CEO of Box of Crayons, which is a company that I founded. And I admire her courage in trying to step into running a company after a chaotic force like me has left it. Um, I admire her focus and her courage, and I think she's a wonderful person. So I would say Shannon.
And big shoes to fill as well. So
Yeah,
taking that on. Yeah,
but all founders leave a complicated legacy to whoever follows them because
yeah,
they've got their fingers everywhere and they've got their DNA everywhere, and they're not just a role; they're sort of more like a fungus that permeates the system. And so you're not trying to replace a person; you're trying to fumigate a system.
yeah. We're going back to the wood wide web
Yeah,
now and the hidden life of trees, aren't we? So we
that's
go
right.
everywhere. And finally, who would you like me to reach out to and invite to come on this podcast? Who would you like to hear on this podcast in the future?
Well, I have a friend called Mark Bowden, and he is an expert in nonverbal influence and communication. He has a wonderful TEDx talk called, I think, The Truth Plane. Um, and he's delightful and funny and smart, and he'd be a good guest.
Well, I'd love to get Mark on. So I'll follow that up afterwards, Michael, and hopefully we can
Sounds
get that
good.
introduction and find time in Mark's diary. Well, listeners, I hope this podcast has made you want to be brave. Prioritize, ask questions. The book itself that we've been talking around, it's a really powerful book. I think what I really liked about it, Michael, is that it's fun to read because
Thank
you're a
you.
fabulous storyteller. So there's lots of different anecdotes within there, but it's also a workbook. It contains worked examples, frameworks, scripts of what to say, how to say it. And so, what we do know, and hopefully that's come through loud and clear today, but we know it from our working careers, that not every working relationship is going to be fantastic, but nearly every one of our working relationships can be better. So if you're going to go down that path of commitment to build the best possible relationship with each other, of your key people, then this commitment, if you follow that, will definitely lead to success and happiness.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick.
So many learnings in the book. Of course, many other books of yours. We've talked about the coaching habit and the advice trap. If people want information, the first port of call, is it mbs.works?
It is. Yeah, MBS.works is kind of the portal into this world. You'll find me on social and stuff there. If this book in particular has grabbed your fancy, then bestpossiblerelationship.com. If you go there, you'll see an opportunity to download the 5 questions, and also you'll see a video of me having a keystone conversation with somebody on my team. So you can kind of see what that looks like being role modeled.
Fabulous. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed myself today, and I've learnt a lot as well along the way too from the book and also the conversation. So thank you again, Michael.
Nick, thank you. It's a pleasure.